Hi, everyone. Welcome to HTRI's Q&A session. We're going to put our presentation up in 1 second. If we could, it looks like everyone already is doing this, but just please keep yourself on mute for the time being. And when we come to the Q&A, we'll let you go off. Okay, great. All right, we know your time is valuable, so we're going to just go ahead and kick this off. I'm Jenny Sorensen. I'm the director of the Human Trafficking Research Initiative. We're here today to talk with you about our current call for expressions of interest for full research funding. So if you go to the next slide. So today we're going to try to just go briefly over IPA and the HTRI team and what HTRI is. We'll move on to our competitive fund overview. That's where we'll spend most of our time talking about the overview and the request for information. So we'll talk about the focus, methodology, the requirements, evaluation criteria, and the submission process. And then we'll have our Q&A. So if you go to the next slide, as I mentioned, if you can just keep yourself on mute if you're not talking. Please ask questions at any time in the chat function. We did get some questions in advance and we've tried to answer those. So when we're going through the presentation, we'll try to answer questions if you've asked those already. If you have something early on, again, feel free to write it at any time. If we can, we'll answer it during the presentation. If not, we'll add it to the Q&A at the end. And this will be recorded and then we'll put it on our website along with the slides. So don't feel the need to furiously take notes. If the information's in the slides, you'll have access to it within, we think, a couple of days after this, this webinar. Okay, go ahead to the next slides. Next. Okay, so if you're not aware of Innovations for Poverty Action, that's the organization that houses the Human Trafficking Research Initiative. We're pretty well known for our evaluations, our randomized control trials especially. We've done over 1,000 of those in 53 countries to date, and we have 17 country offices, mainly in Africa, Latin America, and one in Asia. And we have many other areas of expertise in addition to human trafficking, including education, financial inclusion, and intimate partner violence. So if you work in any of those areas too, we would love to talk with you about those as well. Go to the next slide. As I mentioned, I'm the director of the HTRI team. I work closely with Alina Bitran, who's our associate director, and Valentina Farinelli, who's our senior program associate. And then we also are guided by the work of Guy Grossman and Cecilia Moe, who are the academic leads for HTRI. Go to the next slide. So the Human Trafficking Research Initiative, again, I think I see a lot of familiar names on this call, so you may already know about us, but in very brief, this initiative was started in 2020. We are funded by the U.S. Department of State's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, their program to end modern slavery. And so the main goal of the initiative is to strengthen the evidence around human trafficking. This is in response to a recognition that there was a lot of research that had been done around up till the point of 2020, but not many rigorous evaluations, not enough research that was done to examine the causality of interventions and their impact on human trafficking. So HTRI is really trying to fill that gap. We are fostering partnerships between researchers and practitioners, looking at research methods on studying human trafficking. And then one of the biggest things that we're doing is trying to fund that new research. So funding formative pilot testing and early stage formative research to examine whether causal experiments can be done on human trafficking, and then also funding large scale research studies that focus again on experimental methods. Go to the next slide. So our main components are the research and learning agenda, our competitive fund, and then outreach and dissemination. And so the research and learning agenda, I'll go into a little bit more in the next slide, but this is our formative document. This examines all of the work that's been done to date on human trafficking. And then we kind of parse out what we think are the priority research questions that we should be looking at moving forward, including the one that is the focus of today's webinar. Our competitive fund is the mechanism that we use to fund new research and to fill the gaps in research, as I mentioned earlier. And then outreach and dissemination, we've done about 3 years of, or funded about 3 years of research at this point. And so now we're starting to collate all of the things that we've learned to date and looking at what research methods are working, what are the kind of, what's the information that we can be getting out to you and to implementing organizations, policymakers, and others to inform your research and to inform future programs focused on human trafficking. Next slide. So as I mentioned, our research and learning agenda is really our guiding document. So I won't go into a whole lot of depth about this right now, but just to mention that please do look at this research and learning agenda. We're asking that you respond to what the questions that are in there. If there aren't questions around prosecution that should be in there, then you can also propose to answer those. But we really encourage you to look at this, the research and learning agenda. It is linked in the guidelines and also in the application. Go to the next slide. So these are our priority learning questions. Normally our calls for proposals are open to answer any of these questions, but as my colleagues will go into more detail in the next slides, this one is really focused on that third question around prosecution. Go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Valentina to talk about the competitive fund.
Thank you, Jenny. So as Jenny mentioned, the competitive fund is really our mechanism for which we fund new research that aligns with our research and learning agenda. And so we have two main types of funding for research. The first one is seed funding, which is a smaller amount of money between $10,000 and $50,000. And this is meant for the earlier stages of a research project. So for example, it can be used for piloting an intervention or for piloting an evaluation of an already established intervention. Or it can be used to fund travel or staff time to look at a nascent research idea or to establish a partnership with an implementing organization. And finally, seed funding can be used, for example, to work on a data analysis using existing data from a program to start looking at the impact of the program. And our second type of funding is funding for full-scale impact evaluations. So this is a larger amount, up to $500,000, which is meant to fund a full RCT or an impact evaluation using quasi-experimental research methods. And we say this can be used for partial or for full funding in the sense that, for example, if your research project already has existing funding and needs complementary funding, we are happy to provide that, but we're also happy to fund an entire RCT from the start. Next slide. All right. So here we just wanted to show you the research projects that we have funded so far. And on the right-hand side, you can see in darker blue are the seed funding that we have given, and in lighter blue are the RCT funding. And so you can see that we have given more seed funding over the years than RCT funding, given the different size of the different amount of funding, but also given that seed funding is sort of useful to kind of start new research projects that can eventually be evaluated through a full RCT. And in the map, it's just to show you where these research projects have taken place. And you can see they have been a little bit all over the place. We tend to fund more research projects in low and middle income countries, since, as we have specified in the application guidelines, we can also fund research projects that are based in high-income countries, but only as long as they benefit beneficiaries from low and middle-income countries. And next slide. And so in this slide, we have included 3 examples of funded projects that we have funded so far, and all 3 of them are RCTs. And I'm just going to go into detail into one of them, and that is the one that we have funded in Greece. And this is just to show you an example of a research project that is based in a high-income country, Greece, because it was predominantly, entirely benefiting people from low and middle-income countries, given that the beneficiaries of this project were asylum seekers and refugees in Greece. And the project was looking at how providing legal information to asylum and refugee seekers could reduce their vulnerability to exploitation. And so in this project, it was actually, we provided complementary funding. The project already had existing funding, but we funded this RCT that took place around between 2022 and 2023. And next slide. And so far through the competitive fund, we have given out 3 rounds of seed funding. And we are looking into providing a fourth round of seed funding in 2025, probably in the spring. And in terms of full-scale RCT or impact evaluation funding, we have so far submitted 2 rounds, and this is the third round that is going to be, for the first time, focused entirely on prosecution, but we will also have another general funding round for all RCTs at the end of 2025. And I'm going to pass it over to Alina.
Great. Thank you so much, Valentina. So in this third section, we're gonna go into the request for expression of interest that's currently open. We're gonna talk a little bit about the focus of this call, the process, eligibility requirements, and all of those other considerations for applying to the fund. So starting with focus, as Valentina and Jenny have already mentioned, this is a bit of a new and a particular call, and that we're specifically focusing on this third question of the research and learning agenda that's focused on prosecution. So the main question that we want to answer is, how can governments improve judicial effectiveness, combat corruption, and disrupt criminal networks and systems that allow trafficking to continue? And from here, we have identified these 3 sub-questions. Again, these sub-questions have been identified based on a long process of consulting different stakeholders, but we're not only limiting to these 3 questions. We understand that there are also many other prosecution-related questions that may be interested, and we're very happy to receive those from you as well. The reason why we're focusing on this third question specifically, we do understand that all of these questions are important. However, this third one is perhaps a bit more difficult to answer just because of the complexity of conducting research studies with the criminal justice system. So we're hoping that by focusing specifically on this round, we can kind of nudge more projects to be answering these questions. But the idea, as Valentina was mentioning again, is to zoom out during some of the next funding calls and be open to receiving projects across all of the other questions. So if your project might not be the best fit for this third question of prosecution, know that there will be more funding calls that will again be looking at more general questions once again. And we wanted to provide the slide just to give you an idea of what prosecution-related research could potentially look like. This is not at all an exhaustive list of all of the interventions that we're interested in, but really more of an illustrative kind of look at some potential examples that could be interesting. And again, this comes from an evidence review of prosecution-related research. So here in this first column, we have some promising interventions that we've identified in the literature. And in the second column, some potential areas of study related to this intervention. So some interventions could be survivor-centered training for law enforcement, multi-agency task forces, use of digital evidence and expert witnesses, specialty courts, integrated legislative approaches, restorative justice and comprehensive victim support, community trust building, and law enforcement. Again, not all of these interventions may lend themselves easily to RCTs, which is again why we were speaking about the complexity of this third prosecution round. But if you do have any ideas and you want to talk about these with us, please do feel free to reach out early, and we're happy to talk about the ideas and how these could potentially fit into an experimental or quasi-experimental design. And finally, finishing with focus, we also wanted to talk about what definition of human trafficking we're considering under this funding call. We know that there are many definitions that could be used, but for the purpose of this funding call specifically, we're looking at 2 types of human trafficking. This is sex trafficking, which is when a trafficker uses force, fraud, or coercion to compel a person to engage in commercial sex. And the second definition is forced labor, which is when a trafficker recruits, harbors, transports, provides, or obtains a person for labor or services by using force, fraud, or coercion. So if possible, we would like to see in your proposal kind of specifically talking about which type of trafficking you're addressing, and to be very clear about that. Then moving on to methodology, this funding call is considering 4 different approaches or methodologies to this full round. The first one is full rigorous studies. So under this first category, we're considering full randomized controlled trials or high quality quasi-experimental studies assessing counter-trafficking prosecution-focused programs. This may also include follow-up surveys or downstream studies. These are generally between $50,000 and $500,000, but in some exceptional cases, we may consider applications for more than 500,000, and we're very happy kind of to talk about that early on to see if the project that you're proposing could be eligible for this. The second type is adding a human trafficking arm. So perhaps there's already an existing study that's looking perhaps at a human trafficking adjacent outcomes. And if there could be a possibility to add a human trafficking arm to this study, and that's something that we're very interested in as well. So building into a previous study, and these grants are generally between $100,000 and $250,000. The third type is adding new survey modules or survey rounds. So this is, for example, if you already have kind of a prosecution study and you would like to add one more follow-up survey to see long-term outcomes, for example, that could be a very good fit for this funding call as well. And this is generally between $50,000 and $125,000. And then finally, we're also interested in small research pilots. This is perhaps where you're interested in looking at an RCT later down the road, but there are some initial questions that must be answered in order to be able to get there. So perhaps there's questions around feasibility of actually conducting the RCT. Perhaps there's still a need to test out the measurement tools. So this is also a good opportunity to prepare that upcoming RCT and to conduct the smaller pilot. And these grants are generally between $10,000 and $75,000. And finally, we highlight that research that is exclusively qualitative or descriptive will not be considered for funding. This research is very important, and we always like to kind of integrate this qualitative research as well into these promising interventions. However, just because of the mandate of HTRI, we are interested in looking at more of these kind of rigorous quantitative studies at this point. Moving on to requirements, in this slide we highlight 4 of main categories of requirements that we want you to be aware of. So first, starting with research teams, there must be in the team at least one PhD holder or candidate in a relevant social science discipline. We are going to be looking for experience in field research, randomized evaluations, and human trafficking in the target region. And we really do encourage diverse multidisciplinary teams. We would like to be kind of looking at local researchers in the area that can really and meaningfully contribute to the project, multidisciplinary approaches, and to the extent that some of these projects can consider individuals with lived experience, we also really highly value that in the proposals. In terms of subrecipient organizations, it's important to note that HTRI can only sub-award to organizations, not to individuals. The organizations to which we can sub-award must have established financial, procurement, and HR policies, which is something that we'll be looking at during some of these earlier due diligence process. They must require that they have a unique identity ID from SAM.gov. This is something that can also kind of be obtained. And then here, just to note that unfortunately, India-based nonprofit institutions cannot receive funding due to some of these restrictions. Looking at geographic focus, Valentina already mentioned this part of geographic focus. But here, just to notice that we are looking at projects kind of all over the world, but we are interested in low and middle income individuals or projects that can benefit low and middle income individuals. So there is the possibility to maybe conduct a project in a higher income country, like the project that Valentina described in Greece. But for those cases, we are going to be very interested in seeing how they benefit low and middle income individuals. So that's going to be very important. And then finally, in terms of allowable costs, the cost must primarily be for research and programmatic costs. And you will see in the expression of interest that there is already an early section describing how some of these costs will be used. We can provide funding for limited implementation costs on a case-by-case basis. But when these costs do come up, we're mostly going to be looking kind of at the cost that would allow this intervention to be ready for an RCT. So maybe the sample size isn't there and we need some implementation cost to be able to get that intervention to the correct sample size. Maybe they want to add an additional treatment arm in the intervention that we could potentially fund. These are the type of costs that we're going to be looking at for implementation. We're probably not going to be looking too much at kind of starting out a brand new intervention or an intervention that doesn't currently have funding. Low and middle income research salaries are allowed. High income country salaries are considered on a case-by-case basis. And then finally, we do encourage individuals to budget for publication, dissemination, stakeholder engagement activities. To what Jenny was mentioning earlier about this third component of dissemination, we do want to make sure that these research projects get out there and that these results are really disseminated and help inform decision making later down the road. So to the extent to which you can also highlight how these results will be disseminated, we'll be very interested in looking at that last part. Finally, moving to evaluation criteria for this third run, just so that you know how your proposal is going to be evaluated, we're going to be looking at 5 main categories. First, we're going to be looking at the relevance to the HTRI priorities. So does the study really address the gaps in HTRI's research and learning agenda? Is it theory-driven? Are the research questions theory of change, project viability clear and realistic? Second, we're going to be looking at the academic contribution. Does the study advance social science knowledge? Does it isolate causal mechanisms and inform broader counter-trafficking research designs? Third, we're going to be looking at policy and survivor relevance. Is there demand for policymakers? Are research activities survivor-centered and empowering? Will findings actually be usable by decision makers? Fourth, we're going to look at funding and value for money. So we're going to be making sure that costs are reasonable, realistic, allowable under U.S. Department of State rules. Is value commensurate with expected contributions? And then finally, we're going to be looking at relevant experience. As you all know, it's not easy to implement some of this randomized controlled trials, or sometimes it's even more difficult to implement quasi-experimental research. So we are going to be making sure that the correct expertise is there, both on the research and technical side of this, but also kind of as the research team has this multidisciplinary focus that makes them sensitive and knowledgeable about the topic to be able to carry out a good research proposal. So these are the 5 evaluation criteria that we're going to be looking at. You'll see this criteria come up during the expression of interest, and you'll have the opportunity to answer those questions and make sure that they're aligned with these criteria and priorities. Finally, in terms of the process, I'm sure you already saw this in the guidelines, but here highlighted in yellow just to make sure that you don't miss it. The proposals are due on our portal by 11:59 p.m. US Pacific time on Friday, January 10th. And it's important to note that all applications and research projects must be submitted in English. Once these are submitted, the EOIs are going to be reviewed by an expert group of researchers and policymakers. We're going to have a great selection committee that's really going to take the time to look at these proposals one by one, and they're going to be assessed against the evaluation criteria that I just shared. Successful expressions of interest will be invited by the selection committee to submit a full proposal and will receive detailed applications instructions at the time. So again, there will be a second stage for full proposals. For now, we're only looking at this initial expression of interests. And please do let us know if you're experiencing any challenges with the online portal. We ask that you please let us know ahead of the deadline rather than afterwards. Finally, I want to mention that with sufficient notice, we are very happy again to speak with you, to talk to you about your proposals. We're happy to schedule calls, kind of brainstorm together with you. Our job and our goal is to help you get the best proposals ready and out there in order for us to send to our selection committees. So please do reach out early and let's brainstorm together. Finally, we encourage you to reach out to our country offices. Implementing randomized controlled trials is not easy. There's a lot of field logistics involved, and this is what IPA is the expert at. So if you do have an idea for one of these field projects, we do encourage you to reach out to our country offices. As you can see here, and as Jenny shared earlier on, we do have country offices all over with all of this great expertise. So here are the emails of some of the key points of contact in each of the offices, but also feel free to email our HTRI account directly, and we'll be happy to put you in touch with the correct individuals. And then moving on, and to finish up our part of the presentation and open up to hear all of your questions, we're going to look at the timeline. So as you can see now, we're opening the calls for expression of interest and hosting this public question and answer session. January 10th, the expressions of interest will be due. Late January, we're hoping to finish the review of the expression of interest with the selection committee and to invite certain selected applicants to submit a full proposal. Full proposals will probably be due around early to mid-March, and winning grants will be notified of award in mid-April. And we're hoping to get everything ready. You can see that this is a long process for the project to be fully executed, but we're hoping that the subcontracts can be signed in early July, and this is officially when the projects will begin. In terms of the individual projects, so the individual project timelines will vary based on individual proposals. Maybe pilots can be a little bit shorter, or maybe some of those projects again can be shorter. Maybe projects that are asking for a full RCT are going to be longer. So these individual timelines can vary, but we do expect research projects to launch in mid to late 2025 as per the timeline above, and to close before the end of 2027. And that is all on our end. We hope that this was a helpful overview of some of the questions. We already integrated many of the questions that we received into this presentation, so many of these are there. But now we would like to open up the floor to hear all of your questions and all of your thoughts and ideas. So I'm gonna stop sharing. And we see that we already have some questions in the chat. So we can start with those. Open up the chat.
So I think we have one about individual applicants and then university professors. So I think we'll just finish that one up and say that, yes, if you're a university professor, you can apply. We would expect that that award would go to either the implementing organization that you're working with or your university. If you have more questions about that, then feel free to ask in the chat. The second one I think that I'd like to address is the question of LMIC. So it is a little bit confusing, but we will accept applications for projects that focus on people from low and middle income countries and high income countries. We cannot accept all high income countries. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation, we are funded by the US Department of State. And so anything that is in the US, we cannot fund. There are other agencies in the US government that do fund and are eager to fund research projects happening in the United States. So if you have one of those and you want kind of a referral or want to talk about that with us, we're happy to push you to the right agency for that, whether it's Department of Justice or Health and Human Services. For other high income countries in Western Europe, for example, the Department of State, we spoke about it with them and they said that they are unlikely to be able to fund one of those because, again, those countries do have adequate resources and their own funding mechanisms for funding that kind of research. So for this fund, for example, with Greece or there are some countries in Europe where we can fund projects that focus on, again, individuals from low and middle income countries. So if you're saying, I think the question was whether you would not include them, but still the work would benefit people from LMICs, I believe that would be fine. For some things that are very specific and gradient, we're happy to have an offline conversation with you. So you can please feel free to reach out to us and we can have a more detailed conversation. I'll maybe hand it off to Alina or Valentina if you want to take the next question.
So I can take one of the next questions. I see in the chat a question: if an organization lacks a PhD holder within their institution, can they contract a professor? So again, we are interested in the PhD holder just because of the nature and the complexity of these randomized controlled trials and quasi-experimental studies. We really want these projects to succeed. So part of the success is making sure that they do have a very strong methodological design. So on this end, we're also very happy to do some of this matchmaking. We have a good network of principal investigators and researchers that are affiliated with HTRI, and there's some of our other sectors and human trafficking adjacent programs under HTRI. So if you do have an idea for a good project and you're looking for a researcher that could join our team, please feel free to reach out to us. And again, we're very happy to do that matchmaking and connect you with some individuals that could be a good fit for your project. Valentina, do you want to take the next one?
Yes. So I see Katarina has asked, are applicant organizations permitted to submit multiple EOIs, or are there any limitations on number of applications an organization may be involved in? So if you have multiple projects that you think are relevant for this funding call, please feel free to submit all of them or both of them. And also, if you mean in different funding rounds, that's also okay. If you have already applied for funding with HTRI in previous rounds, there's no limitations in terms of applying for this round. And then I'm just going down.
And take this next one that's asking, it's a great question, asking what we mean by prosecution. This is a great question. As you saw, we have the fourth piece of human trafficking defined by the Department of State. So we do talk about prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnership. However, the prosecution piece spans broader than just prosecution. So we're looking really kind of encompassing the entire criminal justice system, from identification and referrals to investigation, prosecution, adjudication, and legal aid. We're looking at case outcomes and survivor outcomes. So really kind of anything within that criminal justice pipeline is going to be something that we're interested in. So definitely not just looking at prosecution, but really the broader criminal justice system.
And I just wanted to take very quickly the follow-up question from Aman about being a university professor in India. So yes, as long as the sub-award can be given to your institution, so your university, and as long as your university can be considered as a for-profit institution, which I'm not sure whether that's the case for your university.
Okay. I think that there was a question, it looks like, about the origination of the funding. In this case, whether NICRA can be covered, or maybe it's IDC. I'm not sure if that means indirect costs, but yes, we are happy to accept any organization's NICRA. So that's NICRA's negotiated indirect cost recovery agreement. And so if you are a US-based organization or university, you have hold a NICRA with the US government, then we will accept your NICRA rate. Oh, and then I guess I'll just mention, I'm not sure if we covered this in the slides or not, but if you don't have a negotiated a NICRA with the US government, then there's a de minimis, and that would cover your indirect costs. And so this will be the case for anyone based probably in Europe or Africa, and that the de minimis is 15%. So the maximum indirect cost that we can cover would be 15%.
Okay. I see another question on whether there's a preference for US-based institutions or US-based academics. And the answer would be no. We are looking, again, we'd love to have multidisciplinary teams with really a good range and combination of backgrounds. So we are going to be prioritizing or looking specifically at projects that hopefully have researchers based in the country that the intervention is being studied, researchers with a good criminal justice background, researchers with experimental or quasi-experimental background. So again, we're more interested in the combination of the researchers and making sure they have the right experience than any one country specifically beyond the country where the project is taking place, which is something that we definitely want to have that local expertise there.
Alina, do you want to take the quasi-experimental versus experimental approaches?
Yes. Yes, so there's a question in the chat. How likely is it that quasi-experimental approaches or kind of natural experiments would be considered versus a full RCT? In this case specifically, we understand again the complexity of conducting RCTs in the criminal justice space and specifically with human trafficking. So we're definitely very open and very excited about receiving these quasi-experimental designs. Perhaps the only caveat I would say here is that quasi-experimental designs are very difficult, perhaps sometimes even more difficult than RCTs. So we're definitely going to be looking at these even more closely and making sure that the design is correct, that you are able to identify kind of a feasible counterfactual, and that the setup is correct. So definitely open to quasi-experimental studies, but we would kind of encourage you to make sure that those are very carefully set up and designed. So that's something that we're going to be looking for.
So I'm just seeing an earlier question about comparative studies that examine intervention impacts in multiple countries. So I just wanted to say in relation to that, it might be perhaps a bit more challenging to do a comparative study looking at the impact of an intervention in multiple countries using an RCT or other experimental or quasi-experimental methods. But if you have a research design that looks at such a question and again is compatible with these research methods, then yes, absolutely. And please let us know if you have any follow-up questions. Perhaps we can address those via email.
Yeah, we would be happy to support something like that. We recognize, though, with the amount of funding that we have available, it may be difficult. So if you have a lot of complementary funding that you could bring to the project, and then the $500,000 from each tier, I would make that a reality for you, then we were absolutely happy to support that. But we do recognize, again, there are constraints with the amount of funding that we have available for this. I think we haven't, there's a new question that came in about conflict affected countries and standing up projects there. We would be open to discussing that. We do recognize that there may be safety and security issues involved in that. So I think for anything in a place like Sudan or Haiti would be another example, anywhere where there are sanctions from the US government against governments in particular, those would be more sensitive contexts. So I would actually really strongly encourage you to reach out to us so we can have a discussion about that before you put time into an expression of interest. We would want to check with our State Department colleagues about that.
And then for the next question that just came in, is there a specific limit on the duration of projects or end dates? Kind of individual project timelines are going to vary based on the individual proposals. We expect projects to launch in mid to late 2025. And again, the dates may vary in terms of finish date, but we would be expecting these projects to likely be finishing before the end of 2027. So around a year and a half there.
And I also see a question that asks, please share if there are any specific requirements for the EOI, for example, length. So if that refers to the proposal itself, I would encourage you to have a look at our application form. So our application form has already preset questions, and only a few of the questions have a specific number of words that you can use. So those are the questions that relate to your research question. So before starting to prepare your proposal, I would encourage you to have a look at the format of our application form.
If you asked a question and we missed it somehow, please feel free to just copy and paste it again or unmute yourself and ask it. I think one last question that we realized we did not answer was if we could share, I think, how many applications we expect to fund out and what's kind of the general pool of applications versus funded projects. That definitely will vary. So in some rounds we typically have around 40 to 50 applications. For this one, we're really not entirely sure how many because most of the previous applications have focused on prevention and protection, as we mentioned earlier. And so that's why we are focusing this call specifically on prosecution because we want to see more research being funded in that area. So we expect to fund, again, if we're providing partial funding or adding a survey arm to an existing project, then we would be able to fund more projects like that. If we get applicants that are asking for the full budget, then we would be able to fund fewer of those. So I think we would expect to fund 2 to 5 applications. And so again, if we usually get around 40, but for this round, we are expecting fewer applications. I hope that helps. think we have one more question that came in, and then please feel free again to ask any more questions. There's one about different types of interventions, the different kind of criminal justice actors, and then are you meant to do research on the different interventions and measuring the impact of training, for example? Yes, you feel free to set up a research design and a research question around the impact of training on the different actors within the justice system. We're happy again to talk with you. I think Alina mentioned in one of her slides that we can talk with you about your initial ideas and or maybe review an early draft of your research question. So if you want to dig into that area, definitely the training of justice system actors is something that we're really interested in exploring, and the numbers are there typically to support a full RCT in that area. So we would definitely encourage that. Other than that, it seems like our questions are winding down. So we again appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us again. For those who weren't here earlier, we're going to share the slides and a copy of this recording on our website. So if you registered, we'll also send a follow-up email. We'll let you know when that is up on our website. And if you have additional questions, Valentina has put in the link to our website, and then you can also reach out to us with our email address that's in the slides and on our website as well. So thank you for this, and we appreciate your time. Have a good rest of your day.